All right, welcome to the Temple of Silver Stars public webinar. My name is Matthew. I am an academic track instructor in the Temple of the Silver Star. And Temple of the Silver Star is a modern mystery school in the tradition of the Golden Dawn and the AA. We offer structured training in magic and mysticism in both our academic and our initiatory tracks. And if you'd like to learn more about Temple of the Silver Star, I'll give you some contact information, our website, and some other things at the end of this class. So tonight, this will be another just standalone class like I've been doing lately. And so this class is called Nothingness with Twinkles, the Infinite Zero. And we will get to the quotation that's drawn from in just a moment. Let's go. All right, so we're going to start off with one of the principal deities of Thelema, the goddess Nuit. As you'll see, we'll deal with some of her, look at some of the symbolism and conceptions of her coming out of the Book of the Law, and that'll get us into our main theme for the class today. So, of course, you can see here the stele of revealing, or a detail of it anyways, picturing the principal deities of Thelema. And so we have the star goddess Nuit here, her body arched over the entire scene, and then Hadit, who we'll be talking about a little bit tonight as well, and then Rahor Kuit as well. So Nuit, who in the words of Frater Echad, is the star goddess who is not. And I've got a quote here, which we will see again in a little while, from Liber El, the Book of the Law. And this is the goddess Nuit speaking here. Since I am infinite space and the infinite stars thereof, do ye also thus. Bind nothing. Let there be no difference made among you between any one thing and any other thing, for thereby there cometh hurt. So already in this quote here, in the image, we're seeing some of our principal themes here, the starry expanse of the cosmos, the idea of infinite space, infinite stars thereof, and the idea of infinity and the mathematical concepts of infinity and of zero and nothingness will be some of our principal topics for the evening. So another quotation here from the Book of the Law. The image you see there on the right, of course, is the star card from the Thoth Tarot, also depicting the goddess Nuit again. And so in the Book of the Law, chapter 1, verse 59, we read, "My incense is of resinous woods and gums, and there is no blood therein. Because of my hair, the trees of eternity." So this last part here, because of my hair, the trees of eternity, this gets us into our core core symbolism here. So in the Laws for All, Crowley's commentary on the Book of the Law, in the commentary to this verse, and specifically this idea, because of my hair, the trees of eternity, Crowley says, it seems possible that Our Lady, referring to Nuit, it seems possible that Our Lady describes her hair as the trees of eternity because of the tree-like structure of the cosmos. This is observed in the star sponge vision. Talk in just a moment about the star sponge vision. And as we'll see, this idea of a tree-like structure, that the cosmos, Nuit herself is identified with the cosmos, right? I mean, she is the goddess of all the stars. Right, she is identified with the entire cosmos, and that there's also this sort of tree-like structure and filaments and infinite connections within the cosmos. So this star sponge vision is a vision that Crowley had. That is he himself, and as we'll see, put great importance on this vision. But I think it's something that is sometimes not as well known or not as prevalent in people's studies of Thelema as perhaps it should be. So that will be, I think, the core of our discussion tonight will be around this vision of the star sponge, and then a lot of connected and related concepts and ideas. So if you want to get the full version of this, the Laws for All, in that commentary to chapter 1, verse 59, you can read the entire account of the vision and some of the various kind of subvisions or Crowley's own unpacking of some of the implications of it. We won't be looking at all of that tonight, but I encourage you definitely to go and look there if you want to get more about this. Anyways, He says, there is a vision of a peculiar character which has been of cardinal importance in my interior life, and to which constant reference is made in my magical diaries. It appears very essential to describe this vision as well as possible, considering the difficulty of language and the fact that the phenomena involve logical contradictions, the conditions of consciousness being other than those obtaining normally. This again is something we'll come back to, that because these things touch on mystical truths and mystical experience, they are necessarily beyond, they involve logical contradiction and other kind of seeming absurdities. This is a constant principle in Crowley's thought and teachings, especially deriving from his understanding of portions of the Book of the Law, that as he puts it, truth is supra-rational. That reason and the ordinary codes of logic only take us so far, that these things are sovereign on their own plane, but there are higher realities beyond what ordinary logic and reason or even the human mind are able to comprehend. And so I think we'll be seeing throughout this class the way that we can use the human mind and logic and reason to approach or to set us in the direction of these things, or even to just kind of demarcate a space of something beyond what we can know with our ordinary states, and I think also to give us some sort of presentiment or kind of I think of the right word, but to help to open us up to the possibility of having these sorts of experiences for ourselves. And to kind of set a pathway forward for our own, investigations into these sorts of experiences and states of consciousness. All right, so just continuing on here. He says, I lost consciousness of everything but a universal space in which were innumerable bright points. And I realized this as a physical representation of the universe and what I may call its essential structure. I exclaimed, nothingness with twinkles. I concentrated upon this vision, with the result that the void space, which had been the principal element of it, diminished in importance. Space appeared to be ablaze, yet the radiant points were not confused, and I thereupon completed my sentence with the exclamation, but what twinkles? Let's go. So a few of these ideas here we will definitely come back to. But I think one thing that's important here and that I just want to highlight now is that this vision Crowley identifies as a vision of the universe itself, of the essential structure of the universe. That the universe itself is in the sense nothingness with twinkles, right? Which again is also a kind of contradiction and an absurdity. Nothingness couldn't have twinkles within it or points of light within it. So there's obviously something, again, beyond our ordinary reason and ability to comprehend those sorts of ideas going on here. And as we'll see also, this idea of the void space will be one of our themes here. And then these sort of radiant points that fill all space, but are also not confused as well, gets into some of Crowley's own thoughts about this experience led him into the study of the mathematics of infinity, which we'll also talk about tonight. And also, again, just in all of this, although we'll be talking about things like nothingness and contradiction and these sort of difficult topics, I think it's also just important to realize here too that the sort of the wonder and the awe and the beauty of this vision is really at the core of this experience, that it's not something that was first or primarily intellectual or abstract. And this idea of nothingness, which can be a kind of frightening or sounds sort of nihilistic or whatever, is definitely not that. I mean, this is a vision of beauty and of connection and of light. And I just think we should keep that in mind in everything that we'll be talking about here tonight. All right, so then he continues on here and says, the next stage of this vision led to an identification of the blazing points with the stars of the firmament, with ideas, souls, etc. So if we want a more concrete image here to kind of associate with the vision that he's having here, we can think of the the universe itself, which is mostly empty space and is mostly dark, but is punctuated by stars, by points of light. And so not only the stars within the physical universe are these kind of twinkles within the void of space, but that we also see the same structure on abstract levels. This is with ideas, souls. So even in the immaterial, we have the same kind of repeating structure that we see in the physical cosmos, which I think is one nice example of the principle of as above, so below, that the structures of even immaterial or higher, abstract spaces, the kind of idea space, the collective unconsciousness, whatever you want to call it, that somehow has the same structure as the cosmos itself, which is all this sort of twinkles or points of blazing light within a dark void. All right, so we're obviously talking here about, again, this sort of nothingness with twinkles. These are obviously getting to some of the very deep fundamental questions about the nature of reality and of existence. So approaching this from the point of view of philosophy, what some people have called the fundamental question, of all of philosophy, or at least of metaphysics, is why is there something rather than nothing? Why is there a cosmos? Why is there existence? Why is there creation rather than just no cosmos or no creation, right? We could think of this as kind of the fundamental question. So a few possible answers here in no particular order and far from being exhaustive. We have first from Leibniz giving a version of what is often sort of classical ideas of this, especially in like theistic sort of contexts, that there is, in Leibniz's words, a necessary being bearing the reason for its existence within itself, right? And so for Leibniz and other like monotheistic thinkers, this is God, right? That God is necessary, that God must exist, right? So that the reason that there is something rather than nothing is because there's a being that has to be. We could also think of the idea of a self-created being. I always think of Ra, in some of the Egyptian mythology, who's described as being self-created. In a lot of modern, so that's one possible answer. In a lot of modern thought, especially in kind of scientific materialism and kind of modern forms of atheism, this question is just basically rejected, that there is no reason given, that it just happened. It's just a kind of brute fact of existence. It's just a sort of brute fact that there is existence. There's no real reason for it. There's no explanation for it. This is what Terence McKenna calls science's one free miracle. His kind of sarcastic or satirical sort of account of materialist science is basically that given the one free miracle, that there should be a universe, that it should have, the laws that it does and all this, then science can explain everything from there. But there is some sort of fundamental thing that has to be sort of glossed over, ignored for that sort of materialistic account of existence to be able to work. Other philosophers, modern kind of analytic philosophers, have tried to reject the question itself and say that it's incoherent, and find various ways of saying that it just doesn't mean anything. And so it doesn't need an answer because it's not a coherent question, which, is obviously not satisfying. I think there's an intuitive sense that this does mean something, right? That there is a real question being asked here. It's not, it's not nonsense, but it's one possible track that some take. Another example here of a sort of modern philosophical take on this is from Heidegger, who says, well, I'll just read the quote here. He says, really, to ask this question signifies, this question being, well, he phrases it in his own kind of technical terminology, but essentially this question, why is there something rather than nothing? So he says, really, to ask this question signifies a daring attempt to fathom the unfathomable question by disclosing what it summons us to ask, to push our questioning to the very end. Where such an attempt occurs, there is philosophy. So Heidegger agrees in a way that the question is impossible, that it's an attempting to fathom the unfathomable, but nevertheless, he's not rejecting it and saying that he's reaffirming that this is a fundamental question and that it's a valuable pursuit. It's just that ultimately it is unfathomable. Right, and a couple other things here, or sort of shifting gears now from answering the question, why is there something rather than nothing, to trying to redefine some of the basic like structure or the assumptions that lead into that question. And so one way to do it is to challenge the idea of an opposition between something and nothing. And as we'll see, this is very much Crowley's own approach. So two examples here. The first from Hegel, from his Science of Logic. This is from the opening few paragraphs of the Science of Logic. He says, nothing is, therefore, the same determination, or rather absence of determination, and thus altogether the same as pure being. So basically what he means here is that the idea of a pure being, he's contrasting, like talking about pure being and pure nothingness. But because pure being or pure existence just doesn't have any qualities, there's really nothing else that can be said about it, right? So this is what he means by the absence of determination, that there's nothing else that's true about it. It doesn't have any properties, any structure, anything like that. It's just being. And exactly the same thing is true about nothing. And you're right. So he says that pure being and pure nothing are therefore the same, right? Because they're both like empty of qualities or content, or again, he's calling determination. Their truth is therefore this movement of the immediate vanishing of the one into the other, becoming, right? So Hegel's idea is that pure being and pure nothingness are identical, and that this like kind of dialectical opposition between being and nothingness is resolved by becoming. And he talks about the idea that being is constantly passing away, like being is passing away into nothingness, but that nothingness is passing into being, and that the two right sort of mutually pass into each other and produce becoming. And, the idea of change, that something could be, that something could become, and then and then cease to be, and that so this whole universe we have is the universe of becoming, is in a way the result of the sort of the overcoming of this apparent opposition between being and nothingness. That's really sketchy, and I don't claim to understand Hegel, but that's some of the basic idea there. Let's see. So Kristen's asking, would Hegel's view kind of go along with the Hebrew idea of a heye, esher, heye? Not exactly. I think the heye, esher, heye would be similar to what like Leibniz was saying on the previous slide, where Leibniz is saying like a necessary being bearing the reason for its own existence within itself. That you have that idea of like a self-created, that God just sort of is what God says. I am what I am, or I will be what I will be. The grammar can be like kind of read both ways there. So that's I would take that more as like as still within being, rather than identifying being and non-being. But we will see that idea in the Qabalah. Just I wouldn't directly connect it with that particular like formula. And as we'll talk about, that formula is particularly associated with Kether, which is definitely into the realm of being. What we're talking about here is a little bit like higher than that, but good question. And it's certainly not unrelated. Okay, let's see. And then sort of Hegel is very much, as he was probably aware, Hegel had studied the Qabalah, is saying much the same thing that Azrael of Verona, who was one of the really early important foundational Kabbalists in I think he's 12th century or maybe 13th century. He says much the same thing. He says, nothingness is being and being nothingness. Our limited mind cannot grasp or fathom this, for it joins infinity. And this idea of infinity here and the Kabbalistic ideas of infinity is something that we'll definitely be unpacking. All right, so let's look at, so as I said, these last two quotations here from Hegel and from Azrael of Verona here, I think are similar or kind of resonate with Crowley's own understanding of the cosmology or cosmogony given in the Book of the Law. So this is from book 4. It's from one of the appendices I think that we called, I think, what is it? On the reception of the Book of the Law. I think it's one of the last appendices in book 4, but it's really important. It's got a bunch of really interesting and important stuff in there. It's definitely worth reading if you haven't read that section there. It's easy to overlook, but there's a bunch of important material in there. Let's see. So anyways, Crowley says, it is useless to represent the universe as something and inquire into its origin, for that origin can only be a something else equally inexplicable. We must therefore represent it as nothing. But when we ask ourselves what we mean by nothing, we see that absolute nothing must be a nothing of no kind, in no way, nowhere. This is logically equivalent to something of some kind, in some way, somewhere, which is in fact the universe as we see it. The equation confirms us in calling the universe nothing, but it may be asked whether we have taken any real philosophical step by doing so. I think yes, for we have made it absurd to inquire how the universe arose. We have learned that nothing cannot exist, right? So along these same sort of ideas here, Crowley's trying to show that it's not that, there is a universe as opposed to there being nothing, as if it was possible that there could have just been nothing rather than existence. But that, in this sense, nothingness and being are being equated with each other. And Crowley's trying to do it here. I don't know, we need to put too much stock in this particular specific argument, but I think just the general thrust or kind of impulse here is what's important. That nothingness itself is identified with being through its kind of own self-negation, right? The idea of nothing of no kind, in no way, nowhere, is something of some kind, in some way, somewhere, right? So that it's just a kind of logical or sort of necessary truth that being and nothingness, are the same, and therefore the universe has to be. Let's see, some people are sharing some nice quotes and ideas here in the chat. That's great. Please feel free to do that. Let's see. Okay, so this kind of idea here of a nothingness, or such an absolute nothingness, that it is kind of self-negating and then it therefore is identified with being. Crowley tries to represent this in an early essay of his called Bereshith. He represents this mathematically as 0 raised to the power of 0. And he sort of makes a mistake in trying to understand what that 0 raised to the power of 0 represents. His little proof that he does involves a division by 0. And so he doesn't get to the right answer. But I think it still works, that this idea of 0 raised to the power of 0, and the actual mathematical answer is 1. Any number raised to the power of 0 is 1. So this idea of nothingness, but it's nothingness to such an extreme level that it can be, again, this isn't, we're not saying that literally 0 to the power of 0. This is more of a symbol here that this absolute nothingness is being represented as, or symbolized by 0 raised to the power of 0, which is equal to 1. It's really easy to see that any number raised to the power of 0 equals 1. If you take, for example, 2 to the power of 0, you can show that it equals 1. Just this applies to all other numbers as well. But if you sort of break 2 to the 0 into something equivalent to it, like 2 squared multiplied by 2 to the negative 2, right? So when you're multiplying, two numbers that have the same base but different exponents, you can add their exponents together. So 2 to the second multiplied by 2 to the negative second equals 2 to the 0. And 2 to the second, obviously, 2 squared is 4. 2 to the negative second is 1 over 4. So 4 times 1 over 4 is 4 over 4, which equals 1. And exactly the same thing applies to all other numbers. So we know that 0 raised to the power of 0 equals 1, which is a mathematical way of symbolizing some of these concepts. Let's see, yeah, a bunch of comments are going on in the chat here. All right, so yeah, let's just talk a little bit about the number 0, because it'll be important in some of our formulas here. but the history of the, just a brief history of the number 0. So before we get into our specific history here, it's just worth noting that in the Americas, the use of as we'll talk about here, the development of the digit 0 is often taken as one of the the most important mathematical innovations, right, that so much of mathematics involves this sort of realization of a symbol to represent the 0, and the idea that 0 truly is a number is necessary for so much of mathematics. Let's see. So it's just worth noting that in the Americas, predating even the Maya, they had a 0 digit. It may have been the Olmecs who developed that. Anyways, our story here, doesn't take place in the Americas, but it's just worth pointing out. So, for our history here, this really starts with the Babylonians. The Babylonians have a kind of a placeholder symbol, which is, they don't use it on its own to represent 0 as a number in itself, but they do start to have a symbol to represent because they use a positional number system like we use, right, like in our system, right, where we have multiple digits and the order of them determines their value, right? If the digit 4 just on its own obviously means the number 4, but if it's followed by another number, then it represents 40. If it's followed by 2 other numbers, then it represents 400. And so you have to have a placeholder so that, for example, if you had the number like 407, you have 4 in the hundreds place, meaning 400, and then 7 in the ones place, meaning 7. You have to have some sort of placeholder to indicate that there's nothing in the tens place, right? So the Babylonians, although they're using a base 60 system, right, you have the same sort of basic idea. The Greeks don't do this. The Greeks are very resistant to the idea of 0. They don't like the idea that nothing could be a thing. They're also very resistant to infinity, which is probably why they really didn't develop arithmetic, because to develop arithmetic to any kind of depth, you really need the 0, but they developed geometry instead. So you have mixing of Egyptian, Babylonian, and Greek mathematics. And then Alexander the Great, his army brings these mathematical systems to India, where in India, because they don't have the same sort of resistance to the idea of the void or nothingness, or like a void that precedes creation. This idea is really embraced in India. And the Indians develop a lot of the sort of basic ideas of what becomes algebra, which you really can't develop algebra without a 0. And so they do for algebra what the Greeks do for geometry. Eventually, this Indian mathematics passes into the Islamic world. And it is further developed, and then finally it eventually comes to Europe with the Indo-Arabic numeral system, the basic numeral system that we still use in the 11th to 12th century via southern Spain, the Islamic Spain, which is also around the same time and the same route that a lot of really important esoteric texts are coming into Europe. A lot of magical texts, philosophical texts, stuff on algebra or on alchemy, magic, astrology, all of this stuff is coming through southern Spain into Europe. It's interesting also to note that the English word 0 derives through Italian, from medieval Latin, through Arabic to the Sanskrit word shunya. And shunya, you might know the concept of shunyata from Mahayana Buddhism. That is connected to this idea of the 0 here. And although we don't have time for it in this class, I think it's really interesting to compare a lot of these ideas that we'll be talking about with some of those Mahayana Buddhist ideas of shunyata or emptiness, which is also a sort of boundlessness, that everything is not separate and is dependent on everything else. All right, so another kind of concept here for about 0, especially as relating to the physical universe, that really resonates with what Crowley's talking about, and some of these Thelemic ideas here, is the idea of the 0 energy universe, right? So there's a hypothesis that many contemporary scientists hold, although it hasn't been proven, it's still inconclusive, that the sum total of the energy in the universe is 0, that essentially the mass energy of the universe is canceled by the negative potential energy in gravitational fields, so that ultimately all of the energy in the universe adds up to zero. And Crowley held much the same thing. He says, for in this universe, since it is an equilibrium and the sum total of its energies is therefore zero, every force therein is equal and opposite to the resultant of all other forces combined. The ego is therefore also exactly equal to the non-ego, and the destruction of an atom of helium would be as catastrophic to the conservation of matter and energy as if a million spheres were blotted into annihilation by the will of God. So just this idea that the equilibrium of the universe involves everything canceling out, right? So that the sum total is zero, not as some sort of nihilistic sort of proposition here, but just that everything is balanced. Each thing has to be balanced by its opposite. And so obviously that's coming out of a sort of physical conception of the energies of the universe. But then again, he's extending this principle into non-physical planes, so that the ego is balanced by the non-ego, the self is balanced by the other. So I'm just looking at some of the comments here. Oh wow, there's people talking about Whitehead. Wow, this is great. Yeah, thanks everybody for your comments. So I don't have time to read through them all here. All right, let's just sort of keep moving along here. So a fundamental formula that that Crowley uses, you'll see this all throughout his work, is this formula 0 equals 2. Now, of course, we shouldn't take this exactly literally, as a mathematical proposition, but it is a way of symbolizing what he's just talking about using mathematical symbolism. So this is both a formula of creation of how, 2, meaning like something, the manifest cosmos, the world of, duality and opposites that we live in, how this emerges out of this sort of primal, nothingness, or the primal like void state. So this is symbolized both as a division of that primal unity, and also as the creation of everything. So like we were saying, the 0 here represents the not, the non-existent, or the Hebrew ayin, which we'll talk about more in just a few minutes. And then the 2, the dyad is the world of opposites, the manifest cosmos that we all live in. So we can represent this dyad, again, as a pair of opposites. And so Crowley does this with the numbers 1 and -1. So the idea is that 1 plus -1 equals 0, but that that 1 and -1 are 2 things, so that they add up to 0. So you have 2 things that sum to 0. So I've represented this here as the bars here, the cardinality. It's like how many things are in a set, right? So the cardinality of the set containing 1 and -1 is 2, because you have 2 things in the set. Oh, so let's see. There's a question here. If the 2 can come out from 0, can 0 also come out from 2, or can only 1 or more than 1 come from 2? I think 0 can also come from 2, if not from 1. Yeah. So just in the interest of time, I didn't put it in here, but Crowley uses the number 210 to symbolize like the sort of the reverse process of the 2 uniting into the 1, and thereby like rejoining 0, because it's essentially you're looking at like 1. It's the idea of the 1 plus -1 equals 0. So it's not so much the 1 like coming out of the 2, but the 2 like returning, or the 0 coming out of the 2, but the 2 like returning to the 0. We can think of that as kind of a sort of cyclic process, that everything is sort of coming out of that that primal 0 state and then returning to it again. All right, and then this idea, this sort of formula of 0 equals 2 here is directly reflected in the Book of the Law. And so we see the quote, and this is the goddess Nuit talking here. None breathe the light, faint and fairy of the stars, and 2, for I am divided for love's sake, for the chance of union. Right, so this none and 2, right? This is the 0 and 2. And then at least in Crowley's interpretation of these lines, Nuit herself is this none. She is that state of the primal zero, which is divided into two, divided into one and negative one. But this isn't some sort of like, accident or catastrophe or something that goes wrong, but rather that it's for the chance of union. This division happens so that the opposites are created for the possibility of their being able to unite together again, right? Or this is for love's sake, for the possibility of love between two separate beings. Yeah, like Jung's conjunctio, yeah. Oh, yes, I had the quote twice there. But yeah, I'll just read the rest of it, I guess. Then the priest answered and said unto the queen of space, kissing her lovely brows, and the dew of her light, bathing his whole body in a sweet-smelling perfume of sweat. O Nuit, continuous one of heaven, let it be ever thus, that men speak not of thee as one, but as none, and let them speak not of thee at all, since thou art continuous. And then you get the two lines that I had also on the previous slide. Yeah, okay, so let's keep moving on here. This class was quite difficult to sort of structure. There's a lot of different kind of interdependent pieces and a lot of like connections. So it's hard to kind of put this all into a linear order. I kept rearranging everything just up until just like an hour ago. Another idea that you'll see a lot in both the holy books and in Crowley's like writings and thinking here is the interpretation of nothing as no thing, right? So as not just like emptiness, but as a sort of state beyond like things, beyond like concrete individual things. Right, that this is a kind of pointing towards a sort of transcendental state that is beyond like separation between entities to some sort of totality that is beyond or kind of unitary state that is beyond like a conception of objects or things. So just a few examples from some of the holy books of this. In Liber 65, Liber Quartus Quintus Serpenti, we read, I have gone down, O my God, into the abyss of the all, and I have found thee in the midst under the guise of no thing. So a couple of interesting things here. One is that the abyss of the all, that you have this kind of like an intentional reversal happening here, where the God is being found under the guise of no thing. And so the all, the entire cosmos is being described as an abyss, as if like being in nothingness, we're changing places. Yeah, and so there's again a kind of like scrambling or inverting of some of the normal conceptions, right? And I think that is one way of thinking of what is happening in a lot of some of the holy books, especially in some of the more difficult passages, is thinking of them less as like particular statements, but more as something that tries to do something to your consciousness as a kind of like process that in the concept that in having your ideas kind of scrambled up or in having opposites identified with each other, there's a sort of space opened up for realization or for insight. A little bit like a koan or something like that. For example, something that by a seeming like contradiction or absurdity makes possible like a kind of a jump into an insight that sort of leaps over kind of normal like conceptions that we hold, and then makes possibility of things like mystical insight. All right, in Liber Trigrammaton, we have the idea here, or the line. Now cometh the glory of the single one as an imperfection and stain. Right, so again, a sort of paradox happening here, where the glory of the single one is an imperfection and stain, right? That even the one is some sort of is an imperfection compared to the primal like nothingness here, right? And so again, that this there's a definite kind of paradox or contradiction. All right, and then just one more example. There are others as well, but one more from Liber Ash. I am existence, the existence that existeth not save through its own existence, that is beyond the existence of existences and rooted deeper than the no thing tree in the land of no thing. So here I think you can definitely see there's a question earlier about the eheye, esher eheye, I am that I am, which Crowley kind of glosses as existence is existence, right? But that this is pointing now towards something beyond even that level of kether and existence of a no thing. All right, let's just keep moving on here. We've got a lot more stuff. All right, so another concept that's going to be useful in talking about some of these ideas and in relating to the Qabalah as well is the idea of what's called apophatic theology or negative theology. It also sometimes known as the via negativa, the negative way. So this idea of a negative theology or apophatic theology is the idea of a theology that makes some approach or tries to indicate, the absolute or the divine or God or whatever terminology we're using there, but doing it by rather than saying things about God, but by negating and denying properties. So you have the idea that God, or the absolute or the divine, that nothing you can say of this thing is true, and that even contrary things are false, are each false. That the divine is entirely beyond human language and human reason. So there's lots of examples from this in Christianity and Judaism, and we'll look at some from the Qabalah in just a minute. But I just wanted to give an example from pagan philosophy here. This is from Damascus. Damascus was the final head of the Platonic Academy, who was in a way a victim of his own success. He really did a lot to revive the Platonic Academy and Platonic philosophy at a time when the pagan philosophy was really coming under persecution from the Christians, but was fairly successful in this, which led to Justinian. I think that was Justinian. Issuing an edict against forbidding any kind of public teaching by pagans, and Damascus ended up fleeing to Syria, and the Platonic Academy ceased to exist. But in any case, is somebody unmuted here? I'm getting a little bit of sound here. I'll just mute everybody. Okay. Anyways, he starts to talk about the Platonic idea of the one, that the one in its kind of highest or ultimate sense is not really even describable as one, but he uses the term the ineffable. And so here's just a quotation from him here. He says, "Our soul has, after all, an intimation that of all things of which we have any conception, there is a first principle beyond all and unrelated to all. Therefore, it should not be called a principle, nor yet a cause, nor first, nor indeed prior to all things, nor even beyond all things. Far less indeed should it be celebrated as being all things, nor indeed should it be celebrated at all, nor conceived of, nor even hinted at." So yeah, just sort of illustrating how this kind of negative theology can work. By saying that really nothing that we can say of this thing is true. It is entirely transcendent of all of our concepts or ideas. My slides advance. There we go. All right, so yeah, so let's look at how these some of these negative theology ideas show up in the Qabalah. So now, as we'll see, this way of thinking about the negative, the Ein Sof, which means the infinite or unlimited, and the Ayin, the not or the non-existent. This varies a bit as the Kabbalistic tradition develops, and so different authors do it in slightly different ways. So we'll see a different version of it, the version that we use. But this is a kind of just classic Kabbalistic example here. So I'll just read this is from Gershom Sholom's book, the Qabalah. So he says that Ein Sof is the absolute perfection in which there are no distinctions and no differentiations, and according to some, even no volition. But actually, let me back up slightly. So the Ein Sof here is being used to designate like the Godhead, the absolute, transcendent God, right? Beyond, again, beyond any sort of human conceptions and ideas. God, like sort of in himself. So, right, so the absolute perfection in which there are no distinctions and no differentiations, and according to some, even no volition. It does not reveal itself in a way that makes knowledge of its nature possible, and it is not accessible even to the innermost thought of the contemplative. And then a few pages later, he talks about the idea that the Ein Sof, this sort of the infinite, the Godhead itself, manifests itself as nothing. So he says that Ein Sof, which turns toward creation, manifests itself as Ayin HaGemur, complete nothingness. Or in other words, God, who is called Ein Sof in respect of himself, is called Ayin in respect to his first self-revelation. Right, so that God, before beginning the creation, has to sort of reveal himself as nothing, or has to become nothing in some sense. So Sholem goes on and says that the monotheistic theory of creatio ex nihilo, right, creation from nothing, loses its original meaning and is completely reversed by the esoteric content of this formula. So, the idea of creation from nothing, like in Christian, standard Christian or Judaic philosophy, right, the idea that God, there's nothing that pre-exists God's act of creation, that there's nothing, and then God creates, but not on any basis of any like pre-existing thing. But this idea here is not just that there's nothing before God's creation, but that God has to sort of create nothing, and then it's out of this nothing that creation can then be produced. But this nothing is, in a sense, also God, or this nothing is God from the perspective of the creation. That from our perspective, God is nothing because there's nothing that our minds can grab hold of or can conceive of. So that even though that God is the Ein Sof, the infinite and the unlimited, from our perspective, this thing is nothing. But it's also the nothingness out of which creation emerges. All right, so to quote here from a sort of contemporary Qabalah scholar, Sanford Draub, who writes, he's talking about the Kabbalistic school of Isaac Luria here. So he says, for Luria and his followers, the cosmos as we know it is the result of a contraction, concealment, or negation of the one all-encompassing reality. The world is not a something created from nothing, but rather a species of nothingness resulting from the concealment of the one true reality. The result of the divine Tzimtzum means contraction or concealment. It's the idea that the Ein Sof, the original, that sort of the infinite, the God as the infinite, which is like, sort of infinite presence, filling, for all possible space, that it's so, just infinite in every possible way. And there's nowhere else, or there's no other possibility for anything else to exist. And so that there has to be a kind of the divine has to contract or has to conceal itself in order to make open the possibility of there being something other than just the infinite Godhead. So the result of this divine contraction is the illusion of difference, individuality, materiality, and freedom. Yet from another perspective, in accord with the principle of coincidentia oppositorum, right, the coincidence of opposites, in accord with this principle, this illusion is most real and the foundation of the world and the completion of God himself. So sort of interesting idea here. And again, some of this, this idea of kind of like paradox and contradiction that we're talking about here, that the world is, it's not even just that like in this sort of nothingness that's opened up by the divine contraction. It's not just like there's a nothingness and then in that space something is created, but in some sense the nothingness that God creates is the world. But rather than this like devaluing the world as not real or as not important, this is actually the fulfillment of God, that God has to create in order to, this is an idea that's in a lot of traditions, that God has to create in order to truly be God, that creating is part of what God is. But God's creation is, in a sense, the negation of God himself, so that God is only God insofar as he negates himself in this way by creating something other than himself, like out of this space that he opens up within himself. So again, it's quite sort of paradoxical, but you can see how they're trying to point towards some of these same conceptions that we've been talking about here. This book, Qabalah and Postmodernism. I'm not sure. I don't remember where I got the copy that I have of it. I don't know. I just sort of look around on the internet. Actually, I think I might have gotten my copy off of Abe Books, if you know that website. I think that's where I ordered it, because I remember it was quite expensive in some places, but I found a reasonable copy on Abe Books. All right, let's just keep moving on here. We've got a bunch of stuff more to go through here. All right, so we see some of these same ideas in Thelema, though I think, with Qabalah, while they're sort of pushing into sort of nearly heretical grounds, there is still that sort of monotheistic impulse, and a lot of what's happening there is making sure that all of the sort of theosophical conceptions, all the stuff about the Sephiroth and the sort of the structure of God and the inner nature of God, that there's always something being reserved for something that is entirely transcendent and entirely beyond us. Whereas in Thelema, there's not that same sort of monotheistic impulse towards, shying away from saying too much about the nature of the divine. And so instead of this sort of negative theology, instead we get more into directly the more like assertion of paradox and contradiction in the nature of God. And so we can even see this idea of God being like directly identified with nothing in Thelemic thought. One way is through this sort of formula of L equals La, which is something I've talked about in some other classes that I've done. I'm sure some of you recall that. So the divine name El, Aleph, Lamed, is a name for God. And then Lamed, Aleph, it means not. And so this idea that La is, that God is not, or that God is being directly identified with this sort of negative here. This is also important in some Kabbalistic, kind of Thelemic Qabalah, since, of course, they're both the same two letters, Lamed 30 and Aleph 1. They both sum to 31. And 31 times 3 is 93, probably the central number in the Qabalah of the Book of the Law. Let's just keep moving on here. All right, so as I said, that specific way that we looked at the relationship between the Ein Sof and the Ayin is a little bit different than what we use. So in our tradition here, we talk about three veils, the three veils of the negative, these sort of three levels of non-existence that are sort of prior, metaphysically, like prior to and before the creation of the tree of life. So in our tradition, we talk about Ayin, the not or the nothing, being the highest or the most original, I guess you could say, principle here. And then from the Ayin, we have the Ein Sof. Again, this is the infinite, which the Kabbalists were identifying with the Godhead here. Notice the Ayin, meaning not, right? Sof means limit. So the Ein Sof is no limit, rather than just Ayin being like sort of pure negation. We now have the negation of limits, which is the infinite. And we'll be getting into talking more about the infinite pretty soon here. And then finally, the third level here is the Ein Sof, or the limitless light. So you can see we have a progression from sort of one word to two to three, which is a fairly logical way to do it. But there's quite a bit of variation here in the Kabbalistic tradition. And so the idea is, or at least the way we talk about these ideas, is that that Kether, the one, the first of the Sephiroth, which represents kind of undifferentiated being, like crystallizes out of the Ein Sof, and then the rest of creation sort of follows necessarily from there. But the progression within the Godhead itself is from the Ein to the Ein Sof to the Ein Sof Or. Right, so we can see, yeah, some of these ideas also in the tarot. So let's talk for a minute just about the Fool of the Tarot and some of the like number symbolism related to this card. So the Fool is Atu 0, right? Atu is the 0th Atu of the tarot, and is attributed to the Hebrew letter Aleph. So we get this equation here through the Fool that 0, Atu 0 is the Fool, and the Fool is Aleph, and then Aleph has the value of 1. So we get an identification of 0 and 1 here. In a way, not unlike what we saw a few minutes ago as like 0 raised to the power of 0, being equal to 1. We have some of that same symbolism going on here with the Fool. And as if you read like the Book of Thoth or any of Crowley's other discussions where he talks about the Fool, one thing that the Fool represents is the sort of the step like into creation, the step from the 0, the total unmanifest into being, which is an interesting way of thinking about it. The Fool's the sort of the Fool's like folly as being the folly of Crowley talks about the folly of the Godhead not just remaining in itself, but the folly of creation. So again, not as some sort of negative mistake or something like that, but more as the Fool as a kind of like joyful, playful sort of figure here. That's this sort of the spirit of vitality. But the idea of a kind of a whim here too, that it's not for some sort of serious purpose that the universe is created, but for something a bit more whimsical here, for joy and for beauty, and just for experience, whether positive or negative, entering into entering into becoming and the possibility of experience and interaction and relationship. All right, so just a few more sort of Kabbalistic ideas here from Crowley. We see in a chapter of the Book of Lies, which some of you probably remember me talking about. In that series I did on the I forget what I called it, the numbers and letters symbolism series that I did back in the fall. So he says, "O fool, begetter of both I and not." And so we have one thing is that the letter I there is both I, like the personal pronoun, as well as like the Roman numeral for 1. So both 1, the value of Aleph, and not, the 0 that the Fool is. Now we can see this in Kabbalistic terms here as the ayin, the not, as being equal to with ani, which it means the self, right? And so it's the same set of letters. That's the Nun final, and that's sort of regular Nun there, but Aleph Yod Nun and Aleph Nun Yod. So they obviously have the same value. They're literally just permutations of each other. And Aleph Nun Yod means I or me, and ayin, as we've said, means not. So there's even an identification of like the individual self with this same like primal 0 here. It's not just that we individuals are like down here in creation, separated from the Godhead, but are even identified with it, and that. Crowley, of course, was very familiar with like Buddhist concepts of the non-self, but this non-self isn't simply, in Crowley's thought, isn't simply like an absence of self. The idea that like the self isn't isn't truly existent, but that this non-self is actually like an identification, a mystical identification of the individual with that sort of primal unmanifest Godhead. All right, let's just keep moving on here. One thing that I just wanted to touch on here again, with some of these ideas of nothingness, is the idea of death. And, well, maybe for more, traditionally, the fear of death could involve like fear of, like punishment in an afterlife. I think for most people nowadays, especially anyone who's sort of exited from like a monotheistic context that they grew up in, fear of death is typically, or I think very often, about the fear of non-existence. That that at the moment of death you simply cease to exist. That there's just like an annihilation of the individual. And this is obviously a very frightening and disturbing thing. But, I think building on some of the ideas that we've been talking about here, hopefully that there's at least a kind of opening or the possibility of being able to sort of release some of that fear by the sort of reconception, both of the idea of the self, as well as a reconception of what nothingness or annihilation might even be like. So this is not even having to get into concepts of things like like reincarnation or any other sort of like life after death kind of beliefs that you might have. And it's not to say that those things aren't aren't true or whatever, but that I think there's also a level here where by re-understanding what nothingness could be, that you don't even have to, assent to some sort of belief in life after death or a belief in reincarnation in order to be released of the fear, that death will simply be a sort of terrible loss of your individual self. So in a text that Crowley wrote on death, he addresses this idea here. And he says that, let's see, to them that think themselves immortal, that dwell always in eternity, conscious of Nuit, right? And as we've been developing Nuit as the kind of personification or the image of that primal zero or that primal nothingness, right? Who is again pictured as a goddess, full of love, throned upon the chariot of the sun. There is no death that men call death. In all the universe, darkness is only to be found in the shadow of a gross and opaque planet. As it were for a moment, the universe itself is a flood of eternal light. So also death is but through accident. Thou hast hidden thyself in the shadow of thy gross body, and taking it for reality, thou hast trembled. But the orb revolveth anon. The shadow passeth away from thee. There is the dissolution and the eternal ecstasy in the kisses of Nu. So this idea of the loss of the individual limited self is the loss of this darkness, and that the dissolution in the sort of the primal zero is eternal ecstasy, and is sort of figured as the kisses of the goddess. And we see some of these same ideas echoed in the Book of the Law itself. Just one example verse here. Strive ever to more, and if thou art truly mine, and doubt it not, and if thou art ever joyous, death is the crown of all. Right, I think that just sort of speaks for itself, that death is, again, not some sort of catastrophe, and not something to be feared, but is actually the return to the sort of the primal state of light and eternal ecstasy. All right, let's see. We definitely need to just speed up and move along here, but I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the mathematics involved in these conceptions of zero and infinity, because they were important for Crowley, and they were important for Crowley's understanding of the Book of the Law and of the importance of the Book of the Law. So just really briefly here, we've been talking about zero, and there's been some mentions of infinity as well, but I just wanted to link these two concepts together mathematically because they are linked. And kind of historically linked to some of the worry about the existence of zero is also related to or like the Greeks or other cultures that have been sort of unsure about whether zero is really a number. There's also worry about the idea of infinity, something that is just sort of boundless and unlimited, whether that could really exist, and even a kind of threatening sense that it would completely overwhelm any concept or any separation or any kind of like structure, right? The infinity can be sort of quite it can be almost as terrifying as nothingness. So these two concepts, and mathematically speaking, these two concepts go together. So so just briefly, like looking at this mathematically here, right? So the equation like y equals 1 over x, 1 divided by x. So as you know, because we're dividing by x, the larger x is, the smaller y is going to be, right? If x is 1, right, y just equals 1. If x is 10, y is 1/10. If x is 100, it's 1/100th, right? The larger x is, the smaller y is. But as x gets smaller and smaller, like smaller than 1, y gets larger and larger, right? So if x is 0.5, then y equals 2. If x is 1/4, 0.25, then y equals 4. So as x gets smaller and smaller and approaches 0, y increases like without bound, or tends towards infinity. And so now, as I'm sure a lot of you already know, normally division by 0 is not allowed. It like breaks arithmetic. If you can divide by 0, you can prove that 2 + 2 = 5 or whatever else. In some mathematical spaces, division by 0 is allowed. And when it is allowed, the idea is that division by 0 has an infinite quotient, right? So that x divided by 0 equals infinity. And then similarly, normally division by the infinite is not allowed either, but in spaces where it is allowed, division by infinity equals 0. And so we're definitely short on time, so I'm not going to explain exactly what's going on here. But this is what's called the Riemann sphere. It's a mapping of the like complex number plane onto the surface of the sphere with an addition of a pointed infinity. And so the main thing I just wanted you to see here is that the idea that 0 and infinity are the sort of the poles of the sphere, that the absolute lowest point on the sphere, the kind of south pole of the sphere, is 0. And then the north pole of the sphere is infinity, and just sort of showing kind of visually this idea of 0 and infinity as the sort of opposite poles, or the two kind of absolutes within mathematics. And that they're also, again, although these equations don't normally hold, they're normally undefined, we can see how they're linked to each other in this way. Yeah, let's just keep moving on here. So another place that we can also see in mathematics, which again, were important to Crowley and to his understanding of a lot of the Thelemic revelation. We can also see some of these ideas in calculus as well. So I'm sure some of you have studied calculus, so you'll remember that calculus involves like the summation of infinite series and this concept of an infinitesimal. And so an infinitesimal is like a number it's greater than 0, but it's smaller than any given number. So it's essentially, it's a non-zero number that is infinitely small. And we see this idea also with, where the goddess Nuit is everything. She is the kind of the 0 that is sort of all encompassing. Hadit, who we can see here on the stelae below Nuit, represented here as the winged disc. Hadit in the Book of the Law is the infinitesimal point. So where Nuit is everything, Hadit is like anything. Hadit is any point within the space, but he's the infinitesimal point. So he's infinitely small. And as he says in verse 2 of chapter 2, I Hadit am the complement of Nu, my bride. I am not extended, right? Like it doesn't occupy space. But is the complement, and so a different sort of 0 as the infinitesimal small, rather than that sort of the primal 0 of the entire cosmos that Nuit is. Again, from the Book of the Law, the very next verse, in fact, we have this image of an infinite sphere. So Hadith says, in the sphere, I am everywhere the center. As she, the circumference, is nowhere found, right? So if you had an infinite sphere, the circumference would be nowhere found, right? Because the circumference would lie at an infinite distance. But every point within that sphere would be the center of the sphere, because each point would be infinitely distant from the circumference, right? That's what the center of a sphere is a point that is equally distant to every point on the circumference, right? So Hadith is the center that exists at every point, and Nuit is the circumference that is nowhere, using this image of an infinite sphere within an infinitesimal point at any given point within the sphere that is the center of it. Right. So a few examples of Crowley's own sort of comments about the sort of mathematical infinity here and its relationship to the Book of the Law. I don't actually have a copy of this. The Magical Record of the Beast 666 was the publication of some of Crowley's journals. But Kenneth Grant, just sort of commenting on it, says that in it, Crowley declares that Cantor, who we'll talk about in a moment, Cantor and his school have formulated the mathematical conceptions implicit in the Book of the Law. And then in Book 4, Crowley says, it is difficult to grasp Thelemic cosmology at first by purely intellectual methods, and it is difficult to explain it to people in purely intellectual terms, for the conception involves transfinite geometry. Since the book was written, however, the implicit mathematical conceptions, which were at the time beyond the scope of official mathematics, have been formulated by Cantor and his school. It seems to me a striking testimony to Aiwass that he should have enunciated a system which involved mathematics, which were at the time still unintelligible to anyone living, but which were to become within the next few years the master key of the new treasure houses. So Crowley really sees in the Book of the Law and in the sort of philosophical system that's revealed through it as prefiguring a lot of modern mathematics before he himself knew it, and at least in his claim, before a lot of modern mathematicians were even able to work out these conceptions, that they were already kind of implicit within the Book of the Law itself. And I think this idea was quite important to Crowley. He mentions it in a number of other occasions as well. And I think for him, anyways, it was one of the big confirmations that the revelation he received was genuine. And I think also that it was particularly fitted for the time that we were in now. That it's particularly modern right, and really speaks to the sort of the current conceptions of of the universe, of the nature of reality, of truth in the modern world. That the Book of the Law is very much sort of the time, right, and announcing, in Crowley's understanding, anyways, this idea of a new aeon. Right, a sort of new era of time. And it's just interesting to think of it being hooked into not just sort of ethical conceptions or conceptions about society or individuals, but even into the mathematical conceptions. All right, so just really briefly here about Georg Cantor. I was going to do more, but there's just no way that we could go through. I was going to show you a couple of his sort of basic sort of proofs, but it's just way too much. But I encourage you to look into it. Just starting with his Wikipedia page or something like that. Again, as we just saw, Crowley clearly thought that Cantor's mathematics were deeply tied into the Book of the Law. So I encourage you to do some more research here. Cantor was a German mathematician. He's interesting, his own life is rather interesting too. A bit of a sad story at times. But yeah, you can look into that as well. But he's definitely one of the most important modern mathematicians. He creates set theory, which is now kind of a foundational aspect for all of mathematics. And one way we can sort of talk about what Cantor did was establish the existence of actual infinity. Up until Cantor's time, there's a lot of people who believe that infinities aren't sort of mathematically real, that there's things that can sort of increase without ending, that there's no largest number, but there's no actual infinity. There's just things that just sort of increase without end, but that infinity itself isn't a number, and even in mathematical terms doesn't really exist. But Cantor basically showed that this is not the case, that at least as long as you think that mathematics are real, and that mathematical concepts are real things rather than human abstractions, that infinity is real, or what's sometimes called actual infinity. Cantor proved that some infinities are larger than others, and that there's actually an infinite series of infinities. There's an infinite many infinities that can be ordered, from smallest to largest. In particular, he proved that the real numbers, which is what we can call uncountable infinity, there's actually more of them than the rational numbers, which is countable infinity. Anyways, you can just sort of look into that. I'm not going to try to explain it right here. Interestingly, just as a interesting kind of thing here, his designation for the infinite cardinals is to use the Hebrew letter Aleph. So Aleph, Aleph null, or Aleph, kind of sub zero is the infinity of the integers, and then the next infinity higher than that would be like Aleph one. I don't know, just an interesting kind of thing there that he chose to use the Hebrew letter Aleph, and he was quite aware of a lot of the kind of philosophical and theological implications of his work. So yeah, we should definitely move on here, but I just encourage you to look into that further because as we just saw, Crowley obviously thought it was quite important. Let's see. So jumping all the way back to the beginning here, and in returning to Crowley's vision of the star sponge here that we started off with, he just sort of continues on from where we left off. I perceived also that each star was connected by a ray of light with each other star. In the world of ideas, each thought possessed a necessary relation with each other thought. Each such relation is, of course, a thought in itself. Each such ray is itself a star. It is here that the logical difficulty first presents itself. The seer has a direct perception of infinite series. Logically, therefore, it would appear as if the entire space must be filled up with a homogeneous blaze of light. This, however, is not the case. I regard it as a striking proof of the value of mystical attainment that its results should have led a mind such as mine, whose mathematical training was of the most elementary character, to the immediate consciousness of some of the most profound and important mathematical truths. So he's directly referring back to sort of some of Cantor's work about the nature of mathematical infinities. And at least in his understanding of the vision that he had, he sort of directly perceives the reality of these infinities. And this is before he knows anything about Cantor. It's I think it was a lot of it when he was in the Abbey at Cefalù. He was really studying Cantor and other modern mathematicians and seeing sort of gaining like the mathematical language and terminology to describe a lot of what he had already perceived sort of mystically in this way. And so that the mathematics helped to sort of unpack his own mystical understandings here. So Crowley goes on, he says, the reader must not be shocked at the idea of a number which is not increased by addition or multiplication, a series of infinite series, each of one of which may be twice as long as its predecessor, and so on. There is no mystical humbug about this. And again, that's exactly what Cantor showed. The mathematics of infinity are quite strange. Infinity plus one just equals infinity. You can even multiply infinity by other numbers and you still get the same thing. But there are operations, which is what he gets this sort of series of infinite series. There are operations that can produce infinities that are larger than others, but it definitely doesn't behave in the ordinary way that that numbers behave. But as sort of Cantor was the one who pioneered and demonstrated this, there are rules by which these things they do follow mathematical laws, and those laws can be formulated and proved. It's not like some had feared, like the Greeks or whatever, that this was just sort of would destroy, any possibility of doing math or reasoning, that the order of mathematics extends like into the infinite. And that these things are sort of, again, as long as you think that mathematics are real things rather than just human abstractions, that these are really existing things. But again, they start to sort of go beyond, the mind's ability. Although we can prove that they are real, the mind has difficulty in comprehending them. So just looking at the comments here, a lot of interesting conversation it looked like going on. All right. Let's see, one other example here from the Book of the Law about some of the sort of connections of some of the material coming through in the Book of the Law with modern mathematics. In chapter 3, this is just part of a verse here. Then this circle squared in its failure is a key also. So this idea of a circle squared in its failure also relates to modern mathematics. So this is something that was proven, this was proven before the Book of the Law. It nevertheless kind of hooks into a lot of modern mathematical concepts. So the idea of squaring the circle, which is a really interesting topic. It might be worth like actually doing a class about it at some point, because the symbolism of squaring the circle gets picked up in like alchemical texts and in other places as well. But the basic idea of squaring the circle is to, but it's also very commonly sort of misunderstood and misinterpreted. The basic idea is that it's actually an ancient like geometry problem, that given a circle, construct a square that has area equal to the area of the circle using a compass and straight edge. So this was an unsolved problem for quite a, for 2,500 years, and became a very sort of central problem that many mathematicians were working towards and trying to figure out solutions to. And it even becomes a kind of metaphor for the relationship between the infinite, meaning like the Godhead, represented by the circle, and the finite, representing the square, talking about individual humans, the manifest world, and that in this mathematical problem is sort of symbolized the problems of creation, of our own ability, the human ability to relate to God or to relate, to the absolute. You see that particularly in the work of Nicholas of Cusa, who's a huge influence on Giordano Bruno. So even that, kind of hooks into the kind of history of Western esotericism here. However, in 1882, it was proven to be impossible. It was shown that this cannot be done, at least not in a finite number of steps. If you could take an infinite number of steps, you could do it, but it simply isn't possible because of the properties of the number pi, which we'll just move on here. But anyways, just that it relates to an infinity in the sense that the circle, or pi, because of it's what's called transcendental, is a certain sort of infinity that simply can't be captured by like finite operations. I'm sort of oversimplifying it there, but there you go. All right, let's see, just a couple other examples here of just the use of infinity now as a kind of spiritual concept or related to mystical experience from the Holy Books. Again, there's lots of other examples that I could have given here, but just two here, both from Liber 65. Also, Adonai spake unto V, saying, "O my little one, my tender one, my little amorous one, my gazelle, my beautiful, my boy, let us fill up the pillar of the infinite with an infinite kiss." Yeah, and then the next one quote here: "Thou hast fastened the fangs of eternity in my soul, and the poison of the infinite hath consumed me utterly." So this idea of the poison of the infinite is quite interesting. Liber 65 uses the symbolism of poison quite a bit, which I think we can read as a kind of symbol for ecstasy, for religious ecstasy, and the idea of poison being something that sort of dissolves or destroys like the individual self, our normal conceptions of what the self and the world are. That these things are poisoned by the infinite, which sort of opens everything up into a boundless space, and sort of annihilates all of our ideas and conceptions in the heat of ecstasy. All right, and then I just wanted to suggest that in a lot of these ideas that we've been talking about here, there is this pointing towards a conception of the ultimate nature of things as not being as being beyond difference, right? Beyond the difference of separate things, even beyond the difference between being and nothingness. As we talked about, that ultimately things are sort of radically non-separated. That everything is embraced by the goddess Nuit. Or that she is everything and everything is her, and that all possible conceptions are opposites. Everything is united back into that, or it never stops being separated from the primal zero, the primordial state of things, the infinite Godhead. So just two examples of this, again, from the Book of the Law. You have the phrase, every number is infinite. There is no difference. And now, therefore, I am known to ye by my name Nuit, and to him by a secret name, which I will give him when at last he knoweth me. Since I am infinite space and the infinite stars thereof, do ye also thus. Bind nothing. Let there be no difference made among you between any one thing and any other thing, for thereby there cometh hurt. So yeah, hopefully that just sort of speaks for itself. But I just think that's a very important, a very important thing to spend some time just sort of thinking about this idea of no difference and the particular, I think, wisdom that comes from some insight into that. And just its connection to all the things we've been talking about here, about the zero and the infinite, these very different, in opposite in some sense, but also very deeply connected conceptions of the absolute and their relationship to very fundamental concepts about the nature of reality, of truth, of individuality, and the nature of the divine as well. All right, and so just to close us off here, yeah, I just wanted to sort of return to an idea that we've already sort of spoken about, or at least sort of made reference to, and this idea of silence here. That I guess in a way returning to some of that talk about the negative theology, and what we've already said about. Crowley's idea that the truth is supra-rational, that the experience of mystical experience or insight or the experience of ecstasy, all of these things go beyond anything that we can talk about, using human language, using logic or reason or even mathematics, and so that ultimately, these mysteries must. Simply the only possible expression of these things is silence. Anything else, although it can be useful, it can be sort of interesting, whatever else. To speak about these things, ultimately that silence is the only proper response to the nature of things. And so we see quite a bit in Thelema the god Harpocrates. Now Harpocrates, well, the Egyptian name for Harpocrates is Horpar-Krat, which literally means Horus the child. So the gesture that you see him giving there in the two images, putting the finger to his lips there, for the Egyptians, this is like Egyptians imagine babies like sucking their finger rather than their thumb. So putting the finger to the lip like that is, again, for the Egyptians, just a sign of him being a child, right? It's just a sign of childishness, or just his state as a child. But the Greeks sort of misinterpreted, but I think creatively, misinterpreted this gesture as being, the gesture of silence. And of course, you see this in the AA and in the Golden Dawn, the sign of silence, right? Indicating a mystical silence, a silence, that expresses something about the deep nature of things. So the Greeks kind of reinterpret this god Harpocrates as the god of silence, and it's that kind of Greek reinterpretation of him that he, that he shows up in the Book of the Law and in other like Thelemic texts and Thelemic symbolism. So I just thought it was a sort of fitting emblem to end here with, the image of the god of silence, and the silence that transcends all of our limited conceptions. All right, so thanks everybody. I've actually managed to finish on time today for for once. But yeah, thanks everybody. If anybody has any, I know there's been a lot of discussion in the chat here, which I did not read all of. I'm looking forward to doing that once we're wrapped up. If anybody has any other questions, especially if there were any questions that I just people asked along the way that I just missed, please feel free to either sort of point me back to that or ask them now. I'd be happy to hang out, in chat there. So someone's asking about making a donation. So if you'd like to make a donation, you can do that via PayPal. You can send that to payments@tots.org. We do have a $5 suggested donation for anyone who's not a member. Someone can't use PayPal. We don't have any other, we don't have a Venmo or a Patreon or anything like that set up. So just don't worry about it. It's just a suggested donation. There's my email address if you'd like to contact me. And if you'd like more information about Temple of the Silver Star, or if you're interested in potentially like making an application to our academic or our initiatory tracks, you can go to tots.org and you can see our FAQ at tots.org/FAQ. Let's see, I don't see any other questions. Go ahead and ask questions if you have one, Alonzo. And anyone else? I'll post the recording. Yeah, I'll put it up on YouTube in the next couple of days. Let's see. Alonzo, go ahead and type your question if you've got one. I'll just kind of scroll back up to the chat and see if anything stands out to me here. Let's see, Alonzo says, what is the relationship between chaos and nothing in anti-cosmic Gnostic Qabalah of the misanthropic Luciferian order? Chaos is the primordial state of the universe. It's an interesting question. I mean, I don't know a ton about the sort of that sort of Luciferian material that you're referring to there. I mean, I'm kind of vaguely familiar with some of those ideas. So chaos is a complicated concept for several different reasons. It's used to mean different things. Like the Greek, conception of chaos is not so much like we use chaos to mean something like like disorder, but often chaos is just the kind of primal or like unformed state of things before things get organized. Before like a god or whatever organizes like the primal matter. So that chaos is just a kind of it's just a sort of primal the sort of primal substance that hasn't yet been given like structure or forms. Let's see. This was your question. And nothing. So it's it's not a nothing. Sometimes it might be related to some of those concepts. There's some complex stuff in the Qabalah about that. Especially about some of these ideas of like the kings of Edom, who symbolize the kind of remnants of previous creations. That has a kind of similar sort of feeling. There's also another thing that gets this sort of really complicated is that the archetype of the beast, like paired with Babylon, is sometimes referred to as chaos as well. If you'll see that in the vision and the voice, the pair is given between like chaos and Babylon. And then, the chaos there is just like an alternate name for the beast. This idea of sort of primordial, like generative force. That there it's associated with like the Sephira Hokmah. And so, about that idea of that sort of anti-cosmic or acosmic ideas, I think Thelema kind of goes, I think anyways, that sort of Thelema sort of goes beyond that sort of idea that there's like either like there is a well-ordered cosmos or there isn't one. I think those two ideas, similar to what we've kind of said about being a nothingness or one and zero, those two things are not really as separate as some might see them. So I think Thelema includes both, a kind of acosmic as well as a cosmic vision of things, that those two things are just two different like levels of truth. It's not like one, over the other. And so while, like Nui, as this sort of the primal zero, you could see that as a kind of acosmic conception, but she's also identified with a more well-ordered cosmos. It's just like two different levels or two different, ways of looking at things, whether you're looking at things under the aspect of sort of finite reality or from a kind of infinite perspective. I hope that makes some sense. Let's see, Kristen's asking the book by Cantor. I don't know any books, or I mean, Cantor's actual like published stuff is incredibly like technical mathematics that I don't, I've never read. So this, if you're going to look into Cantor, you probably want to look at like secondary literature. There's plenty of stuff online that you can find. There is an interesting book that introduces a bunch of his ideas called the Mystery of the Aleph, or maybe Mysteries of the Aleph. It has some decent introduction to his like mathematical ideas, and draws some connections to some of the theosophical or theological or like philosophical ideas, mystical ideas, like connected to some of Cantor's work. So that book, I forget the name of the author now, but that book, The Mysteries of the Aleph, is one place that you could start. But yeah, I think unless you're actually like trained in higher mathematics, directly approaching like the work of a theoretical mathematician is going to be quite difficult. Let's see. Let's see. Sarah was asking a question, but I'm not sure what that was in reference to. But it containing all forms, like Plato's idealism. Yeah, I'm not sure what you were referring to there. I didn't see your comment until just now.
Oh, that was on, you were making one of like a metaphor on the Hadith-Nuit relationship. And let's see, and on chaos as, as the precursor to creation and a formative universe. But I forget what I was going on there. Sorry, I lost it too. I'm so tired. But yeah, I was just thinking of chaos as not just kind of the precursor to all formation, but in a mathematical sense, especially through people like into Pythagorean mathematics and mystical, there's a lot of belief that math itself is infinity and is kind of a god, a non-duality, and contains all of the forms of the universe. So I was just linking that to the popular idea of Plato.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, and that's obviously a huge sort of realm of stuff, to go into. And, I think although, it's quite different than the sort of like Greek or philosophical conceptions of chaos, modern like chaos mathematics, I think are also quite interesting. That people might want to look into. Some of the they're connected to like fractals, and which I think has a lot of resonance with ideas about as above so below, or the way that sort of order and disorder have a kind of a deeper relationship than it might seem, and I think it speaks a lot to again some of these like kind of Thelemic conceptions that pre-existed any of the development of that mathematics, but could certainly be related to it. But yeah, that's just way more than we have time to go into right now. Yeah, chaos is containing all possibilities, right? And that's, I think, an interesting idea that you see in some of, like in some of Crowley's kind of Kabbalistic writings, or in other Kabbalistic writings as well, that there's you have like sort of all possibilities, and that there's actually a kind of like narrowing down from that like infinite or like overly saturated sort of state, that there's actually a kind of like creation is in a way like a subtractive process, that some of those possibilities have to be rejected in order for like specific things to come to exist. All right, if there's no other comments here, I will go ahead and stop the recording. And yeah, like I said, I'll get this up on YouTube in the next couple of days. For anybody watching this on YouTube, thanks for watching. And be sure to subscribe to our channel for more. So yeah, thanks everybody, and thanks to everybody who attended live.